I'm Annick De Houwer of the University of Erfurt in Germany, and I'm here in the home of Professor Baetens Beardsmore, who is an emeritus professor at the University of Brussels, the Vrije Universiteit of Brussels, the Dutch and the French-speaking one in Belgium. And Professor Baetens Beardsmore is a specialist on bilingualism, and he used to be my teacher, so it's a real honor for me to interview him. Hi, Hugo.
Hello, Anna.
Really lovely to be here with you. And yes, I have a few questions for you, as you know.
Fire away.
Yes, now it's my turn to ask you questions, and you were examining me a long time ago, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm really interested in finding out, how did you come to the study of bilingualism, actually?
Well, as so many things in life, it's chance, and you seize a chance. I finished my degree in Wales, and my future director of studies, who was a man called Jack Killer Williams, whom everybody called Killer, even his wife called him Killer. And he suggested I did a study on the regional French of Brussels, which I'd never thought of. So I came to Brussels and started doing my work, and I realized, because this was a bilingual city, and because the type of French that was distinct from French in France was due to the contact language, either Standard Dutch or Flemish dialect, that I needed to know things about bilingualism. And so I then immediately started to read some of the big names, the pioneers in bilingualism, let's say the first generation, people like Uriel Weinreich, Joshua Fishman, Wallace Lambert, Einar Haugen, and William Mackey. And these people were all North Americans, or had become North American. And therefore, I read all their work and then realized that our situation here had many interesting features that they hadn't perhaps noticed. So that's how it all started.
Right. Oh, wonderful. Well, you know, and we're all lucky to have your basic principles, Bilingualism Basic Principles, the first book with Multilingual Matters, which came out in 1982, which was, in fact, I would think, the first European origin sort of textbook on bilingualism. And well, and you've done a lot of work on bilingualism since you really started. What do you think, what do you consider the most important thing that you found really about anything bilingual?
Well, over time, I realized, when I started, people always thought bilingualism was a problem. And I had great difficulties in starting to teach a course on bilingualism because I was allowed to teach it if the course was called Problems of Bilingualism. And I always thought unilingualism was the problem, and therefore found that rather strange, but I accepted in order to teach the course. And over time, I began to realize that bilingualism and multilingualism later is such a complex field of studies that in fact there is ever more that we need to know in order to analyze it properly and to answer the questions. And I'm thinking of one of the pioneers, William Mackey, who was a mathematician to start off with.
Oh, is that so?
Yes, he worked in Canada, and he did an analysis of bilingual classrooms and learning a second language in classroom setting. And he came to the conclusion that there were 3,000 variables that could possibly enter into the analysis of what goes on in a bilingual classroom. And then you realize, over time I've realized this ever more, there are so many parameters that can intervene that in fact we now have to be multidisciplinary. Interdisciplinarity is more difficult to achieve than multidisciplinarity because people from different disciplines don't necessarily share the same basic tenets or theories. And over time I've worked on interdisciplinary teams, but we found in the end that we're better to consider ourselves as multidisciplinary. That is, looking at the same problem from the specific angle of our discipline, either social sciences or linguistics or international or politics or whatever area, communication sciences, and then we gradually learnt one another's specialist language and learnt then how to play with some of these parameters or variables. And this is why I think the future of bilingual studies is enormous, because we have far more sophisticated techniques which throw up new aspects that we suspected were around, but we couldn't analyze when I started.
Right.
So I think there's a great future
for
this field of study.
Oh yes, I would fully agree with you. Now I know that you're a great fun person, but you tend really not to toot your own horn. But now I want you to toot your own horn. I would like for you to tell me what you think is your best achievement in the area of bilingualism.
It's rather difficult to say that. I tell you why, because it's other people who decide which are your most useful or interesting articles, even if they criticize them or aspects from them. But in fact, a lot of the work that I've done that really has excited me most of all is the work I've done for international government agencies. And a lot of that work, I have many reports that I've produced that cannot be published, because these things are very often very sensitive, and particularly if you're working internationally. And I've worked on several fairly sensitive politico-ideological issues connected with bilingualism and produced pages and pages of reports. And I'm rather proud of that work, because I learned a lot about how difficult it is to influence policy, but how to go about it. And many academics who have good ideas on policy with relevance to bilingualism are terribly naive politically, because they have no idea how political decisions are taken. And this came home to me when I did my first work at the request of the European Commission onto bilingual education for highly mobile children, which did not mean migrants, because a migrant comes from one country to another and tends to stay there. But these were the children of middle-level parents who would spend 3 years in one country, they'd be moved to another country and then to another. And it was found enormously difficult to enroll these people in their future careers because of the difficulty of educating their children. That is, providing continuity in an education system with a particular language. And as the European Commission always promoted multilingualism, bilingualism for the sake of mobility, that was part of its mandate, they asked me to do a study. And I looked into these things, wrote a report, chaired meetings with parents and trade unions and teachers and all the interested parties, and then drew up final recommendations which were to go to the European Parliament. And I was allowed to sit in at the back of the meetings where the delegates from the different countries, there were only 15 at the time, analysed the proposals. And I was so depressed when I found how critical they were of these things, people from their ministries of education, that at the end, the person who had asked me to present this study came to me and said, "What do you think? How's it going?" And I said, so depressed, "Where's the nearest balcony from which I can commit suicide?" And he said, "You are very naive politically. This is normal in the first round. You now go back to the drawing board with our help, and you reset the proposals, and you come back and you will learn that this is how things work in politics." Now, after that, I went to many different countries and got to work with decision takers in places like Hong Kong and Singapore and Brunei and even California. And thanks to that experience here, my political naivety had been partly eliminated. But I've done several studies, reports for government agencies that are, 200 pages long with very detailed things, very good analyses, but you're not allowed to publish.
Right. And then are they then the things that you have proposed in some of these, have they been implemented then?
Some of them have. It's never all of them. That's again part of being politically naive, as I was at the beginning. You never get them all proposed, but if the proposals you think are worth defending, you come back and you come back and you come back with them. You may need to modify the wording. This is again, it's a kind of political education of how to work in the wings of decision takers on specifically bilingual education. But where I have worked, some of the ideas and suggestions we made were in fact adopted, others not. But then, that's normal, because you never get them all.
That's right. Yeah. So actually this feeds into my next question, which was about the relationship between, research and then the real world, so to speak, world, sorry. Of course, research is also the real world, but yes, can you say something more about it?
Yes, this is very important because some of our work has a real life impact on people in health, in hospitals, with doctors, doctor talk, patient talk. And you tend to find, as one of the American scholars said, the doctors know their business, they're clever. The doctors are healthy and they earn good money. The patient quite often doesn't know the language, is unhealthy, and doesn't necessarily have as much money. But the patient learns the doctor's talk. The doctors don't learn the patient's talk. And that to me was a lesson in the humility that people like ourselves have to have in studying bilingualism, the outreach issues of bilingualism, where you suddenly notice things, thanks to your sensitivity for bilingual questions in general, you suddenly notice there are whole areas of everyday life that can cause friction and can be solved partially. One doesn't expect a doctor to be multilingual, but one does expect the doctor to know the simple terminology that the patient uses to describe pain, so that he can diagnose correctly. And in fact, it is very difficult to use the correct terminology for pain because it's so varied. And so this is just one illustration. The same when I was looking at schools, bilingual schools in the United States, in California, I was amazed at how children who were trying very hard were misjudged by their teachers, who were not bad teachers. They were, generally the sort of teacher you say knows the job. But you would find that the two little immigrant boys from Turkey who sat at the back of the class, who put up their hands to answer the question, never got invited. Never. And it was a kind of subconscious discrimination. And after about a quarter of an hour, they never tried anymore.
That's right.
And the result is then they didn't get the reward of being able to show that they knew the answer. Little things like that. And sometimes the child who was not being taken any notice of was the one right under the eyes of the teacher in the front row. Now, these are the parameters that I was talking about, the 3,000 that can intervene. And this is why books like the Handbook on Bilingualism that you've produced is so enriching, because I doubt if it's covered the 3,000, but there are quite a lot in there that should stimulate to further research. So I think all that we do, unless it's pure theory, is outreach. Anything I've done connected with bilingualism has some, in fact, impact on everyday behavior of different categories of people, including myself.
Yes, no, I think I agree, yes. So how would then, this is my last question, would you have any advice for young scholars starting to study bilingualism? Are there particular areas that you think are more pressing to know more about?
Yes, there are many delicate areas. I think the interaction needs more studying.
Yes.
Because we all interact.
Yes.
And you've written about that in the book, and that's one that really stimulated me, not because it's you, but because it's an area that I live in my daily life, where I represent a statistical minority here where I live.
Explain.
In that I'm a Dutch speaker, that is my official language, and I live in an area where nearly everything is in French. I have no problems with using French or Dutch, except in certain circumstances. And this is again the outreach, and that is in the town hall. Or in an official instance, where here in Brussels, where I live, in my borough. And I was called in to change my identity card, to get a new passport. And the lady at the desk, I showed her the letter in Dutch, and she immediately says, "Parlez-vous français?" And with a big smile on my face, that's important, I said in Dutch, "Yes, but not here, and not today." And then, in other words, she was supposed to handle me in Dutch. She had very limited Dutch. You don't need very much to hand over an identity card. But I was a statistic. And having looked in many government agencies at statistics, if I had switched to French, that's one less Dutch speaker in my commune. And in the supermarket, where the screen automatically here is in French, but you can choose Dutch, German or English, I always touch on Dutch in order just to be one of the statistics. Because since statistics play such an important role now, which they didn't when we started back in 1980, that in fact we have to be very conscious of our own behavior, our own interaction patterns, which needn't necessarily be aggressive ones, but think of the ultimate usage that is made of these machines or the statistics on how representative you are. So these are the everyday consequences of this hypersensitivity that I've acquired to bilingual usage.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. I think, well, is there anything you would like to add?
Only that I wish you all well, and that you have such an exciting life as I have had, thanks to bilingual studies.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm doing my best. Thank you so much, Hugo. Okay, hope you fare well, and thanks for hosting us.